Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Argos Multilingual and Be4ward. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Aneta Bajta and I am the Global Marketing Director at Argos Multilingual, a language solutions provider specializing in life sciences localization projects. And today I'll be the moderator. So before we start, I just want to let you know a few things. Firstly, the webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the presentation and the recording towards the end of this week via email. Also, if you have any questions that come to mind throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A tool to jot these down, and I will be collating all the questions, and at the end we'll have a 15-minute Q&A with Andrew. So today's webinar will be on translation error equals artwork error, get it right first time. And we are very pleased to have our partner, Andrew Love from Be4ward present. So just a quick introduction to Andrew. So Andrew Love is a multi-award-winning packaging and artwork management strategist, leader, and author. He has spent 10 years as head of global packaging design operations at GlaxoSmithKline, the world's second largest pharmaceutical company at the time. During his time there, he oversaw the transformation of the global artwork management activities into a world-class award-winning capability. Andrew is one of the founders of Be4ward, which helps pharmaceutical, biotech, and other healthcare companies and their supply base to improve patient safety and drive additional value from their product range. He now develops products for and works with a number of pharmaceutical and healthcare companies in achieving these aims. Andrew, a professional engineer and MBA with over 20 years of experience, has worked with many of the world's largest life science companies. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. I will now pass the microphone on to you and we can get started with, I believe, the poll.
Okay, thank you very much, Anita. So I don't know if you're able to pull the poll up. Excellent. So there was a couple of questions that we've got here that we'd like people to answer. If you could do, please. The first one was, which sector do you work in? And then within your sector, what's the role? Oh, no, sorry, there's a few questions in here, actually.
Yep. What's your role function? Yep. Do you have a translation services provider?
Languages you translate into, and then what issues are you struggling with the most? So we'll just give you a couple of minutes to answer those polls, and then Anita will be able to pull up the results.
Okay, so 4 out of 21 voted. If anybody else wants to do a quick vote.
Have we got everyone voted, Anita?
Still people are voting.
All
I
right.
see still
okay, that's fine.
Some more coming in. This will give us a good idea of who we have and what kind of issues they're facing. So maybe 2 more seconds. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and end the polling. Okay. And the results are now shared.
Excellent. So looking down through those, we've got a nice mix between medical devices and pharmaceuticals. This presentation that we're doing is primarily around healthcare, so that's good. We've got a lot of people coming in from regulatory labeling and quality. So that's positive because we'll be looking at the implications around the quality of your labeling. So that's a key part of the presentation that we'll be covering. Most of you have a translation service provider, some of you don't, so that's interesting as to whether you do it internally or whether you're looking for a translation service provider. An interesting mix of languages, so some of you are obviously in very large companies going into lots of different countries, some of you perhaps in smaller ones. And then, yes, a smooth labeling process coming through is the number one issue in terms of issues that you're dealing with. And I can understand that. Labeling is a complex activity, and we will talk about that further when we go through the presentation. So thank you for doing that poll. It just helps us understand a little bit about the audience that we've got out here, so that I can tailor some of the things that I'm saying to specifically meet some of the issues that you might be dealing with. So I'm going to stop sharing the results now, and I'm going to pull up the presentation on my screen. So hopefully everybody is able to see my screen. Anita, can you just confirm that that's okay?
Yes, it's
Excellent.
visible.
Okay, so super. So thank you very much, everybody, for giving us the opportunity to talk to you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you may be. And thank you to Anita for the introduction that she did for me there and for inviting us along to do this with you today. There's two parts to the presentation that I'm going to go through. Firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit around the implications of having a labeling error. That may be very apparent to some of you, it may be not to others, but at least it gets us on a common ground. And then secondly, I'm going to go through some tips around ways that you can improve your translation processes to improve your right first time. As Anita said, we'll have time for question and answer at the end, so please submit any questions that you've got. And both a recording and these slides will be made available to you at some point after this webinar. Now, the slides that I'm going to go through, there is quite a lot of content on them. I'm going to move through them fairly quickly, but you will have reference copy of those slides as well. And if you happen to have questions after this presentation that you suddenly think, oh gosh, I wish I'd asked that, then please get in touch with either Anita or myself, and we will make sure we get a response to you. So, moving on. There's a slide in here which is a little bit of background of me. I'm not going to go through this because Anita did an introduction earlier, so thank you for that. So let's move on to the main presentation. So I thought this was timely and worthwhile just putting up on my introduction slide for the present. So some of you may be aware of a news release last week that Australia's new $50 note had a spelling mistake on it. So this comes back to the dilemma of labeling issues. And it's strange that in some ways we have labeling issues today because we've been putting text on paper for a few hundred years now, and yet we still get it wrong. Now, whether spelling responsibility in the background of a piece of currency is an issue or not is not really the question here. But it might be worthwhile getting some of these notes because in a few hundred years' time, they're the ones that are normally worth a bit more money. I doubt if they're worth any more just now, but could be worthwhile thinking about later. So the good news here is this isn't something that's really going to have a particular impact on anybody. You know, it's not a significant labeling error, but it's yet another example of where things go wrong, as they always seem to do. Now, if we look at this more within the context of pharmaceutical industry or medical device industry, things get more significant. So in the middle of this slide is an example of an error that I'm very familiar with, that I've been involved in during my career. So what should have been on the leaflet was 1/3 tablets per day. What was actually printed on the leaflet was 13 tablets per day. Now that was an immediate and fatal dose. There was nothing that anybody could do if you took 13 tablets. That's rare, but what it does show is when we get things wrong in labeling and artwork, it can have a significant impact on the lives of our patients. And those of you that work in this space know that. And some of you may have been involved in incidents like this within your own companies and understand the implications of when that can happen. Now, I appreciate this isn't an issue around translation, but it's still a very relevant issue in the bigger picture of providing accurate information to patients. If you look at the top left here, so why is labeling important? Well, labeling provides the instruction to patients for how to use the product. So another example that we've seen was a leaflet for eye drops where about half of the text had been incorrectly inserted and was actually the text for how to use an eye syringe. So the instruction was telling you to inject into your eyeball, but what you've got is an eyedropper, and that's very difficult to try and stick in your eyeball, obviously. So getting it right is important for the patient, and getting it right is important for the company, obviously. Down on the bottom right-hand side, how the pharma companies see labeling? Well, they don't see it as a process of competitive advantage, but it's a critical backroom process that needs to be done well and needs to be done correctly. And when it goes wrong, generally speaking, it gets a lot of attention within any healthcare company, and everybody hopes it doesn't go wrong. But unfortunately, there's not many people in the organization who tend to understand how it does actually work. And I think one of the things that's troubling is, even though, as I said on the previous slide, we've been putting text on cardboard for hundreds of years, this is still one of the highest sources of recall within the pharma industry, is packaging and labeling errors. So it's our duty as leaders in this space to be trying to continually improve this to reduce the risk that we have with the patients that use our products. So moving on, why does this happen, or what sorts of errors do we see happening? So if you're a healthcare company, as you grow, your portfolio gets more complex, you have more products, you're into more geographies, maybe the types of products you're getting are getting more complicated, but the complexity of your labeling activities increases. And there's lots of different types of errors that you can see coming through. So a gross error is like I talked about earlier with the eye drops and the eye syringe, where major sections of content have been missed for some reason, or the wrong source document has been used for part of the text that's being provided. Context or meaning errors, very relevant around translation, where something in a different language doesn't quite mean the same thing as it did within the source language. The example that we've got here, hyphenation can change a meaning in some ways. Content is where we've got physical difference to what's there versus what should be there. So are we using the right symbols? Are we using the right illustrations? Does A equal A and B equal B and C equal C, etc.? And then technical errors are more things around, either the fonts that are being used or the pagination or specific functionality of the software, where things can change as files are adapted. So an example I would use there is you've built your source text with lots of different fonts by importing text from other documents. But then as you go through the labeling to artwork process and you're manipulating those files, items of text change from being one character to another character depending upon which font they're being read in. That's what happened with the 1/3 becoming 13. So a number of different types of errors that can occur. For those of you that have been involved in a translation project, you will no doubt be familiar that you've typically got a specific end date where this project needs to be complete. We have a product launch that we have to do on this date. We have got a safety update and we've committed to have it delivered by this time. And as you're getting closer to that deadline, if you're identifying errors in the text and having to redo them, you get into this Concertina effect where material is getting rushed round faster and faster and faster with decreasing levels of time to try and still hit that deadline. And the risk that you've got there is that speed is increasing the pressure on people. People are rushing, trying to do work. Your risk of failure increases and people's confidence typically decrease. And you're in this kind of downward spiral with the more rework you're doing, the greater the risk of failure you've got. And when you do have failure, the implications can be quite significant. Right first time avoids that, because right first time means that when you do it, you get it correct in a timely way, and it gives you more confidence with your process, so you get a better repeatability. So we always see that right first time is the fundamental underpinning capability here that companies should be focusing on. Let me just bring through the animation on this slide. So when things go wrong, the implications can be far-reaching and they can be serious, as we've touched on already. There's implications on the patients. There's implications on the healthcare professionals. And there's obviously implications on the external health authorities and regulators that you're working with. There's also implications internally. If you've ever been in a situation where there's been a significant recall, that has a big impact on staff. It reduces their confidence. People don't feel particularly great about it. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to be getting the performance capability back to where it needs to be, and reassuring people that the issue has been addressed and performance has been sustained. But also from a company perspective, there are some significant issues, because companies that have got very poor right first time or very poor performance are normally subject to greater regulatory scrutiny. And that's not a particularly pleasant place to be. So, as we've said all the way through this, it's critical for the patient to have that information correct, and our labeling processes should be making sure that the information that's provided is correct. If the process goes wrong, in most cases, the error should be detected internally, one would hope. But where it's not identified internally, you're reliant upon people in the external environment detecting that issue. And normally there are 4 different ways for how that can happen. The first one is just purely by chance. Somebody sees something, questions it, realizes that it's not right, and informs you. Second type can be through the due diligence that a medical professional is doing. So I can give you examples where the titration levels that were stated in leaflets were wrong, and the medical professional, when they're looking to titrate the product, are seeing this doesn't tie up with how I believe this product should be used. So they question, and that's where we discover that there's been an error. When they're trying to use the product, they can't use it in the right way. So we talked again about the eye syringe and the eye drops. That would be a good example there. And then finally, and the most significant and most unfortunate example is through incorrect use. So we have an incorrect labeling, they follow the incorrect labeling, and then they don't get the outcome that they were looking for. Now, all of us who work in the healthcare industry, one of the key reasons we work in the healthcare industry is because we want to help make people better. And the last thing that you want is the product that you've provided being used in an incorrect way, and you end up actually making the patient worse. So it's not great when an error is detected through misuse of the product because we've harmed somebody who's using that product. Now, an analogy that I would use here is if you go and pick up a rental car, you don't go and think about checking the tires. You assume that the tires on a rental car are going to be fine. Similarly, when we as patients read a leaflet, we don't sit there and think, oh, I wonder if this leaflet is correct. We just assume that it must be because of all those healthcare professionals in the industry that are out there making sure that it is correct. So the trust back to patients is key here. And we have to remember that we're patients and we're people that use these products, and we would expect it to be done to a certain standard. Again, let me just pull up this slide. So when an error happens, there's really two sets of activity that needs to be done. And again, hopefully most of you are familiar with the principle of CAPAs. So on the left-hand side here, you've got the corrective actions that need to be done to sort the issue that's been identified and restock the marketplace. But on the right-hand side, you've got the other set of actions that have to be done, the preventative actions, and they're there to make sure that the error can't happen again. So it's important that you're doing both the corrective actions and the preventative actions. If you don't do the preventative actions, you're not going to stop having that error reoccurring, or at least the risk of that error reoccurring. Final slide, second last slide in this section is just to look at how errors can occur. And we're going to come back to some of these when we go through the tips in the second part of the presentation. So labeling errors can occur because of, for example, gaps in the process. So critical steps being missed, critical steps not being defined well enough, overlapping activities, lack of clarity about who should be doing what. Lack of competence, we would say, is the next one. So this is, you do know what needs to be done, but people haven't been trained effectively in being able to do it. Inappropriate decision making. I think through this process, regardless of the amount of automation that you add to it, there is still a lot of people interaction with the process. And people making decisions that they maybe think are the right decisions at that point in time, but when you look at them more holistically are not the appropriate decisions, can mean that the outcomes are wrong. Ambiguity. People are not entirely sure of what the instruction means. They go and do something, but it's not the right thing to do. Errors in the source information. So if you get garbage coming in, you're going to have garbage going out. We'll touch on that again later. Human error. I don't know if anybody has done any of the tests with text where some characters have been changed within the text. When you're looking at, is this text correct or not? But our brains are wired in such a way that we compensate naturally for things that are not quite right. And so when we look at a section of text, unless we're reading it really carefully or potentially reading it backwards, we'll miss where characters are wrong because that's the way we're wired to work. Technology errors, so issues around, your software doesn't perform in exactly the way that you want. And then the final one on this slide, which I think is the most significant, and particularly around translations, is differing opinions. Because unfortunately with translations, part of it is someone's view or opinion of what an appropriate translation should be for this particular term that you're needing to have translated. And you can get into a situation here where multiple people have multiple views. All of them may be right, all of them may be wrong. The question is, what's the most appropriate for the most appropriate text to be using in that circumstance? So lots of different reasons for how you can have an error. And then just to wrap up this section, there are some clear benefits if you don't have errors and you can move to error-free labeling. It's obviously good for the patient, it's good for the healthcare professionals, it's good for the regulators, it's good for the staff within your company, it's good for your company, and it's good for the shareholders associated with your company as well. So that finishes the first part of the presentation, just looking at what are the implications of error. What I'm going to do now is move into 10 tips that talk about, so how can I improve my right first time? So, tip 1, really simple, measure your right first time. Now this maybe sounds really stupid, but I'm surprised with the number of companies that I go into, and when asked to see the right first time performance, they can't tell me. Now, there's an old adage, which is if you don't measure, you don't manage. So just by measuring what your right first time is, you'll start to understand more about what your performance is. And by measuring it, it already starts to make things better because people start to take more care when they see performance being measured. So what should you measure? Well, on the left-hand side, it has a list of different things there. And really, you should be measuring right first time at all of those different points through the process. Because if you've got low right first time at the beginning, you can guarantee you'll have low right first time at the end. You've got to get your right first time of your text high if you're expecting to get the right first time of your artwork high. It kind of makes sense. On the right-hand side, what types of changes should you measure? So this, again, maybe seems a bit of an odd question. But one client that we were working with said, yeah, we measure right first time on technical changes, and we measure right first time when we're doing routine text changes. But we don't measure safety changes, and we don't measure new product introductions because they're really difficult and our right first time isn't very good there. So overall, it would make our statistics not look so good. Now, that's a really bizarre answer. And what you want to be doing is measuring all types of changes across all points of the process. And you should be aiming for a right first time on your final artwork of well in excess of 95%. Now, that's a big ask for many companies, but that's achievable and it's where you should be. So, tip 1, measure your right first time. Tip 2 is, well, it's great, I know my right first time, but I don't know why I'm getting the issues. So what we would recommend here is that you categorize the types of errors that you've got so that you can see which categories of errors are giving you the biggest count of failures. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that by using some different error codes, you can start to chart, we've had this many failures in right first time because of a source text issue, or we've had this many failures because someone has done something around the file identification wrong, or whatever you think those error codes are appropriate. But what it allows you to do is say, so this is the reason that we're having most errors, and we can then go and apply a rigorous analysis to that type of error so that we can design that out. So on the right-hand side, go through a standard process to identify what the root cause of those errors are, put in corrective action to make sure that they can't happen again, and then importantly, continue to measure to make sure that those improvements that you've put in place are sustainable. Now, what we see with companies that have got really high right first time is this is where they focus their effort. They want to design out the source of error before errors happen, rather than waiting until errors have happened and lose all that energy and having to rectify the mistakes and sort out all the mess. They focus much more on identifying the risks and eliminating those risks than having to go deal with the issues. And that's quite a fundamental mindset change, but it's an important one if you aspire to have good right first time. The third tip, and particularly relevant to your poor translation provider, is make sure that you've got all the information correct before you start. So on the left-hand side here, you're bringing in information from many different parts of the organization, and I've listed down some examples that may be relevant for a labeling change that you're doing. Now, if you don't get all of that together and make sure that it's correct, if that input is wrong, you can guarantee that the translation that will come out the other end will be wrong, because the translation provider can only provide a translation based on what they've got. So as I've said before, garbage in equals garbage out. Once you've got all that information, you need to put that into a clear and unambiguous document to brief your translation provider. This is what we want you to do with this content. So make sure that it's clear and make sure that the translation provider is crystal clear on what it is that they have to do with the material that you're providing to them. And that input material that you've created, before they go and do the translation on the right-hand side of this slide, make sure that that's been approved by the right people in your organization. Yes, this is what we want. One of the biggest reasons for not getting right first time is you provide the information to the provider, you send it out, the translation happens, it comes back, you then send it out to your organization, and people in your organization say, well, why are we doing this? Or that's not actually what I wanted. Or, oh, if you're making that change, could we add this change to it as well? Get people to approve what you're sending to the translation provider before you send it, to make sure that you're sending a single comprehensive brief that's correct and has all of the change defined within it. Now, finally, along the bottom here, we hear lots of companies that say, oh, getting the translation done takes forever, so we like to get it started as quickly as possible. What we would say is avoid that temptation. Get everything together, make sure everything's right, do the translation, and do the translation once. If you're going to keep adding more bits of information, you've got more risk of things going wrong. And by default, it will take longer. So it's much better to get everything together, get it right, and then go and execute your translation once. Moving on, tip 4, make sure you've got a clear process. So what we've got here is our straw man 10-step process for defining a translation. Now, we've got a booklet that describes this a bit more, and I believe that booklet's being sent out with all of the other materials to you as well. But 10 steps to work through to make sure that you've got a quality translation coming out at the end of it. And I think what's important here is have a clearly defined process. Make sure that who does what in that process is also clearly defined. That process should then define your standard workflow for how you do a translation. And that workflow should define the plan that you will be undertaking to do the translation that you can set your timelines to. So this shouldn't vary. This should be a standard way of doing it every time you do a translation. And it's important to plan that from start to end and make sure that everyone's clear on what everybody's got to do. So hopefully that's fairly straightforward. Tip 5, lots of people can get involved in this, but it's not necessarily the core part of their job. So if you look at the left-hand side here of this slide, we've got a number of different teams that potentially could be involved in a translation within your organization. They all have other jobs to do. And translations is normally a fairly small part of the job they do. But you're expecting them to do quality critical tasks in a quality way. So you need to make sure that they've got the right skills, competency, and experience to be able to do that activity. So what training do you do and how do you do that training? So down the right-hand side of the slide, we've got some different training interventions that you may want to think about for how people are trained to do the different things they need to do. Down the middle here, also be clear on what it is that you're looking for from your translation provider. A translation provider is for life, not just for Christmas. So select your partner carefully. Make sure that they've got the right skills, knowledge, and experience to be able to meet your business requirements for the types of translations that you need in the sectors that you operate in and with the languages that you need to use. And I think, you know, the point on the bottom of that list is don't rush for the cheapest. That's not a pitch for Argos in any shape or form. That's just a standard comment that if you want quality, you often have to pay for it. So make sure you're selecting the right translation provider, not the first one or the cheapest one. Building on from that piece around people having the right skills and competency is also making sure that you're doing the right checks with the right people around your translation. So what we would typically see is a 4-step process. There's an initial check by your translator or your translation provider. So make sure that whoever's doing the translation is doing a quality check of their own work. Your translation provider will probably also do some further QA checks. Understand what they are and also understand what they're not, because what you want to make sure is everything's being checked. Don't assume anything here. Secondly, a full and comprehensive proofread of the typeset copy. So make sure that somebody's doing a full review of that text document to make sure that that text document is correct. Now that may be your translation provider that's doing that for you. It may be somebody within your organization that's doing that for you. But somebody has to, so make sure that's being done. Thirdly, a review by your organization. Now, typically, we would say that this would be somebody within the local country, because you've got to consider the language requirements there. You know, you need to understand the context of the text as well as the content of the text. You need to be able to read the text for meaning, not just for accuracy. So somebody who is a local language speaker is important to do your review. But in many smaller companies, you don't have people who are local language speakers. So how are you going to cover that? How are you going to make sure that you've had an appropriate review of that documentation? And then finally, what sort of QA review do you need to have around this? And often what we suggest there is QA are not really the people who are there to approve the content because they don't have content knowledge. But what they should be assuring is that the process has been accurately followed and people have done the checks that they should be doing, and the relevant checklists and authorization documents have been signed off, so that you've got process compliance as well as accurate documentation. Now, one other question that I've just put on the slide here is the whole question around back translations. And some companies do a back translation to verify that the translation is correct. I think that's a very complex area. It has pluses and minuses around, is it a good thing, is it not a good thing? And really that has to be part of your risk determination of your translation provider, your confidence in their ability to be able to translate, and your attitude as a company towards risk. But it's something that we would certainly suggest that you think about. Moving on, tip 7, make sure there's the appropriate cross-functional governance. So lots of different functions are involved in the process. And if you need to improve performance, that performance might not be within the function that you work in. You might be trying to improve the performance in another function or another part of your organization. Now, our learning is that change very rarely happens horizontally in an organization. Change happens top down. So if you've not engaged the senior leadership of the various functions that are involved and get their sponsorship to be improving the right first time activities in their part of the organization, you're going to struggle to improve your overall corporate performance. So getting the right senior people to be providing governance and oversight of your translation activity means that it's easier to drive necessary change down into different parts of the organization where performance is not meeting expectation. Tip 8, IT. So when we engage with lots of companies, IT is normally the first part of the conversation. You can see that we've put it at point 8 in the conversation. You don't solve everything just by throwing lots of IT at it. And we've seen companies try to do that, and all that it does is it masks the people interaction issues, and you're always going to have people interaction issues here. Machine translation is not accurate. You know, Google Translate doesn't work in the healthcare industry particularly well. You are reliant upon people doing activity. So what's important here is making sure that you've got appropriate IT capabilities for the size and scale of your organization. We have a client, they've got one product with one pack that they sell with 4 components, and they're saying that they need to put in a full electronic artwork management system for that. Now that's a huge investment for a tiny little piece of artwork activity. We've got other clients with thousands of SKUs, thousands of products, and they desperately need the right tools in place. So scalable is the key thing here. But what I've laid out on this slide is some of the key functionality that you would be looking for tools for your labeling process, your translation process, and some of the activities within your artwork process. Key one I would pull out is the middle one on the top row, which is translation management. So if you don't have translation management tools internally in your organization, that's something that you should be looking for from your translation providers. These tools are becoming ever more sophisticated nowadays, and tying in with XML technology means that you can be managing elements of content far more effectively and starting to standardize as much of your translation as you can do so that you can be reusing that content where appropriate across your portfolio. Now, as I say, we've not achieved nirvana yet. There isn't automatic translation for everything, but there are many things that can be standardized and can be reused, and that's what you need to be thinking about around your IT services. Nearly finished on tips. Tip 9, give people time and give them appropriate facilities. If you want people to do quality critical work, give them the time and give them quiet space where they can go and do that activity. And I think, I hear so many times the strapline along the bottom of this, I sent you a document for approval 15 minutes ago, you've not approved it yet, what's going on? That's not fair. If you can't plan, don't blame somebody else. Make sure that people have got the time to do the things that they need to do. And then finally in my tips, the last one is make sure that you've got the right culture. So how would you define your culture and how would you measure your culture? Yeah, so how do you want people to behave in terms of accountability? How do you want people to behave in terms of working under pressure? What level of pressure is appropriate? What level of pressure is not appropriate? This is a people-centric area and people create cultures. So define the culture that you want, and then coming back to your governance, make sure that that governance displays and rewards the culture that you're aiming to get. People change is really difficult and it takes a long time, but if you miss this bit, you're just going to fail on all of the other things that you need to be thinking about. So, in conclusion, a busy slide here, but this is really a summary slide for you all so that you have this in the presentation deck. So down the left-hand side here, we've got the 10 steps of the process that we showed you earlier, which is our straw man process for how you would follow a translation. And down the right-hand side, we've got our 10 tips. So by getting a clear process in place and by following these tips, that will help you improve your right first time performance. So in summary, labeling is still a significant compliance risk. It's still one of the highest causes of recall within the industry. But high right first time is achievable, and we've got companies that are working, well into the 99.9% right first time. But it's not easy because it involves many different parts of the organization, and it's a continuous journey to be taking that forward. But if you can get it right, it actually makes you faster and it makes people more confident in what they're doing. But really, it's a mindset that you need to be driving into your organization. So the picture there is just our little booklet around effective translations that I mentioned earlier with the process steps in it. We will send that out to everybody when we send out the other materials. That completes the presentation that I wanted to go through. 3 minutes over on time, but we've still got time for questions. So Anita, if you want to lead the question and answer.
Yes. Okay.
You panicked me there for a minute, Anita. It went quiet. I thought, oh gosh, have I been talking to myself for the last hour?
No. Okay, so I've shared my screen, so hopefully everyone can see it. Perfect. Okay, so there are a few questions, and in the meantime, while we're answering these questions, if there's anything that pops up, please just type them in the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay, so the first one, are there any artwork management solutions online?
There are a number of different artwork management systems out there. They can be available both as internally hosted systems in your organization or as an external cloud system. Most people are moving to external cloud systems because it's easier to bring in their different external partners to it. However, I wouldn't say that there is what I would call a subscription online web-based version that you can just go into and use. It's normally a software package where you're having to buy licenses or buy the software itself. It's also can be a fairly significant investment depending on which tools you go for and what scope you're looking for. But if anybody wants to discuss that further with me, then I'd be happy to have a discussion on that.
Okay, so next one, what is the number of cycles companies go through to get artwork correct?
Yeah, so this is good. So the number of cycles that companies should go through to get their artwork correct should be 1, because you should only need to do it once. That's the glib and easy answer. As I go around companies, I obviously look at the number of cycles that they're doing. The best or the worst that I've seen so far is 85 times it took them to get an artwork correct. So my immediate thought on that was, how many times did it pass over somebody's desk before they stopped really looking at it? I would reckon once you've seen an artwork for the 5th time, you're kind of bored with it. And when it comes back the further 80 times, you're just fed up of seeing it. There isn't really a standard performance, and companies can measure cycles in different ways. But if you've got a cycle of more than 1, your right first time is 0. So your focus should be cycle of 1 and get your right first time up from there.
Okay, so we have somebody who raised their hand, so I'm just going to turn them on to talk. Hello?
You've panicked them now, Anita. They've gone away.
So I think they disappeared. Okay, well, we have one also live question that popped up here as well. Sometimes we have very tight deadlines like launch where time is less in that scenarios. It will not be easy to do the checks on the translation provided by the translation company. Can you please advise how to handle that when we don't have enough time?
So I think, I mean, this is a perennial issue. And my first comment to this is pretty clear, which is, do you want to issue it on time but wrong, or do you want to issue it right but maybe not to time? Now, I know of lots of companies that have gone and launched things and gone straight into a recall, and that's just crazy. So what you need to do is make sure that you are doing the right checks before you put that product out onto the marketplace. Now, the challenge there when you're in a launch situation is, yes, you don't have a lot of time. So design your process appropriately so that you can deliver it either in that time, or that people in the organization understand and respect how much time that activity takes. So if you're doing a full proofread of a broadsheet patient information leaflet, you're not going to do that in 10 minutes. It takes a lot of time to build that in. Now we've got a client, they launched their last product in 8 hours. They still did a full proofread on all of that artwork. But from FDA approval to having that product out in the warehouse took them 8 hours. So it can be done. You've just got to make sure that your process capability is there. And I think anybody that avoids the quality assurance requirements that you should be doing in order to achieve a deadline is running at a very high risk. And that's not a risk that a regulator would accept as an excuse if it was wrong.
Okay, I think our raised hand is now live. So Sandeep, would you like to ask your question? Okay, looks like.
Well, let's move through these other ones we've got on the list here.
Okay, so what are the benefits of using external support to help streamline? Should you use external or from within?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what we mean in this question by external support, because I could read that as using an external translation provider or using external expertise to improve your process, so a consultancy support. So I think what I would say here is, if you don't feel that you've got the capabilities internally for either of those, whether it be translation provider or process expertise and consultancy, then there are plenty of partners outside that can help you. You know, obviously we're one, Argos is one. I don't think there is any fixed model as to whether people see translation should be done internally or externally. What I do see in many companies is they have a bit of both, depending upon the language and which countries that company may be in or not. What I would say is important is to be clear on what you're doing so that people understand, for this language or for this country, this is the approach that we take. And if you've got different approaches for different territories, which is likely, make sure that the quality standards that you're working to are commensurate across all of those territories. So I've got one client who was using a local agent to be doing translation in one country. The local agent changed a number of safety statements, changed the shelf life, went ahead, produced that product. My client didn't do any checks of the text at all. They just produced the product and sent it through, and they're now in court for fraud. So have the right quality checks in place, because when it goes wrong, you will be the ones who will be accountable. Yeah.
Okay. So our internal reviewers spend too much time changing the translations rather than actually reviewing, even though the translation is of high quality. How can I get them to start focusing on their actual role as a reviewer?
Hit them over the head with a big stick. Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on this through some of the presentation. There is a risk about perfectionism in text becoming opinion driven rather than factually driven, if that makes sense. You know, different people have got different views of what the best way of describing this issue is in whichever language you're trying to put it into, and that's a tricky one. So I think it comes back down to education and training. It comes down to measurement, highlighting waste. So, you know, maybe if you were able to show the productivity of different people within your organization, it will show that you've got certain ones that are behaving in slightly different ways. And this is where the whole sponsorship thing comes through again, about, you know, getting the senior management within the organization to be clearly stating expectations. It's an issue I've seen a lot, and it's a very difficult issue to resolve, because people care about the text and you want them to care about the text. That's why they're in the jobs that they're in. But also there's a point where, no, this is good enough and we've got to go to market. And how you balance that people issue is a tricky one. So a number of different things in there: measures, education and training, sponsorship, good change management.
Okay, we have another live question that came through. Do you suggest proofreading as a role to be in the artwork process? As we see many companies don't have proofreaders, it is directly designer and then to RA teams. Many companies think it is extra cost. Moreover, the proofreaders will not be able to check the accuracy of the translation. They only do character to character check. Let us know how this helps.
Yeah. So I think proofreading is an interesting one. Proofreading is a skill that we've kind of lost. So if I look at it first from an artwork perspective, we used to have proofreading. We brought in electronic tools and everybody thought, oh, great, we've got electronic tools, we don't need the proofreaders anymore. And then we learned that the electronic tools can do some things, but they don't do everything. And actually having proofreading in artwork is very important. When you come to the translation piece, yes, a proofreader can't necessarily check all of the translation, but there are a number of elements of the translation that they can check. And it's really defining what's the appropriate checks that can be done and by who. So having a proofread by your translation provider using someone who's got the right language skills is important, because they can be doing that content checking, and it's an independent check from the person who's done the translation to make sure that it is all correct. We think that's good practice. Most of the clients that we work with put that capability in because they understand the risk profile associated with that. But really, it's got to be a risk determination within your organization as to whether you think that's an investment that's appropriate to do or not. We're very strong believers in, full and comprehensive proofreading, but it's easy to say that as an outsider, but we always push our clients around that. Clients need to make the risk determination as to whether it's something that they see is an appropriate investment or not. Our general view is the cost is relatively low when you compare it to the cost of rectifying an issue if that issue hits the marketplace. So that's our view on it.
Okay, so 2 more questions. At what point in the approval process would a change be considered another project instead of fixing a previous change that is not right the first time? Do we try to cut down on the draft, or do we try to cut down on the approval process?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the definition of the brief and getting everybody to agree to that brief. I would say, so we see a behavior a lot where when a document goes out for approval, people try and add in further changes because, oh, we're changing this, I'd like to do this as well while we're at it. That should go in on the brief in the first place. And everybody should be agreeing, here's the brief, this is what we want done. Any change that has to be incorporated in this project has been incorporated, and that's it locked. And that's what you go and deliver to. If someone comes back with a further change from there, you then need to make a clear determination about, well, why wasn't this added before? And introduce a level of pain there so that people do make sure that they add it in before. And then there needs to be an appropriate governance decision about, are we going to incorporate this additional requirement or are we going to stay? And unfortunately, that falls down to individual circumstances. You can't really come up with a standard policy ruling there, because some circumstances may say, absolutely, we should incorporate this, and some circumstances say we shouldn't. I think what's important is that you've got clear black and white decisions rather than this kind of grey evolving requirement that can happen, and that the right people are involved in making those decisions and the implications of those decisions are clearly understood. So that would be kind of the key things that we would say there. It's worthwhile putting effort into getting the brief right to avoid this kind of creeping requirements that happen afterwards. Get the brief comprehensively reviewed, get everything in there that you want, then go translate once, would be the way that we would really want to see it.
Okay, so we have one last question and we've kind of run out of time. So what do you think will be the impact of moving to an electronic patient information model?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think two things come to mind there. But firstly, I think my first view on this is that I don't think that this is going to be a fast switch. In many parts of the world, we already have electronic patient information available. In the UK, I can go onto the web and get an electronic version of the PIL for any product sold in the UK, for example. And that, Australia is even further down the track. But generally speaking, there still has to be the ability to supply the paper leaflet for people who want a paper leaflet, or a Braille copy leaflet, or a large print leaflet, or an audio file, or whatever else. So my gut feel is supplying paper leaflets will continue for a long time, because it will only be when nobody requires a paper version that the paper versions will disappear. How they're provided may change, but I think there'll be paper versions for a long time. So I think the two things that it brings is one that's a positive and one that's going to be a challenge. Positive about a patient information leaflet is you can update it more quickly. So the delay that we currently have between identifying a safety issue and that being incorporated in the physical pack could be anywhere from 6 to 18 months, depending upon the amount of stock that's in the supply chain. If we move to an electronic patient model, an electronic patient information model, I should say, we can change that much more quickly. So the probability that you're looking at the most accurate version or the most recent version of that PIL increases, which has got to be a good thing. Somebody once said to me that looking at a PIL, a paper PIL, is a bit like looking at the stars. It's what it was meant to be a long time ago, but it's not necessarily what it is now. The other side of it, though, is it means we're going to be publishing stuff much more quickly. So at the moment, we've got a bit of a luxury that it takes time from us identifying that we need to do a change to that getting out to the marketplace. So there's lots of time where we've got the chance of catching an error. When we move into an electronic world, it's going to be much faster to have that information out in the public domain. And therefore, the risk profile changes because there's less chance of catching it. It won't go through many of the steps at the end of the process, potentially. As soon as the artwork is done, it will be up and away. So we need to think about how's that going to be different in the way that we assure a process, because the expectation is that time will be much less, and hence it gives us less luxury in looking for where errors might be, if that makes sense. So hopefully that gives an answer to those questions. As I said at the beginning of the present, if you have further questions afterwards, things that come to mind when you're driving home or making dinner or whatever it is you're going to be doing this evening, then please either contact Anita or myself, and we'll make sure that we get responses back. Anita, I think back to you to close the webcast.
So firstly, thank you so much, Andrew, for the presentation, for also answering all the questions everyone had. I really, really appreciate it. So thank you. And to everybody else who was able to attend, thank you so much for attending, for participating. You will receive an email from me later this week with a copy of the recording and the presentation, as well as the white paper that Andrew mentioned in his presentation. And like Andrew also mentioned, if there are any questions, whether it's related to translations or to the artwork labeling process, feel free to contact us at any time.